Almost 45 years ago, China initiated one of the most brutal and despised social engineering experiments, the one-child policy to control the birth rate. It worked as they planned. The population stabilized, and the economy thrived. But then, something alarming began to emerge, putting the future of over 1 billion people at risk and tempting the government to put an end to a 35-year-long and successful strategy. But what went wrong that they had to terminate the policy? From its birth to death, here is everything you need to know about China's one-child policy. China's one-child policy was initiated by Deng Xiaoping in 1980, restricting the majority of couples to have only one child. For years, the government believed that this strategy was the key element in boosting the country's economic boom. The policy was implemented by the country's National Health and Family Planning Commission, with a strict system to fine those who violated the rules, and even forced women to have an abortion. The policy permeated throughout the country so fast that most civil and government employees lost their jobs for having more than one baby. The remaining were forced to limit their childbirth. Otherwise, they would face the same consequences. The government even announced that if any violator did not pay the fine and kept their second child, the government wouldn't register that child in the national household system, which means their second child was essentially illegal and couldn't access any social services, healthcare, or education. The policy resulted in a preference for boys, leading to the practice of sex-selective abortions or infanticide, specifically targeting girls. This preference is rooted in a centuries-old social tradition that values male children over females. However, there was a slight difference for rural families in the policy. They were allowed to have 2 children, provided the first child was a girl. Call it contentious or effective, but this policy indeed worked well for the government by reducing births in China by over 400 million over the years. You will be surprised to know that China began promoting this policy after a year of gaining independence in 1949. But it started to take effect in late 1979 after the death of Mao Zedong. The main reason behind this policy was the overgrowing population of China, and Deng Xiaoping gave this massively growing population rate some serious consideration. In the wake of this concern, they announced a voluntary program in late 1978 to encourage families to limit childbirth to only 2 children, with 1 child considered preferable. But for some reason, a year later, the authorities started demanding no more than 1 child in a family. Initially, this policy was unevenly applied across the country in different provinces, but by 1980, the central government began to standardize the one-child policy nationwide. The policy was implemented more effectively in urban areas where the population was growing rapidly and had less effect in rural areas where families resisted complying with the one-child policy. China is renowned for its strategic approach in every endeavor, and they did the same with this policy. They used certain methods, including offering incentives and preferential employment to those who adhered to the policy and imposed sanctions against those who resisted compliance, both economically and otherwise. As the policy took effect, China saw a significant reduction in the birth rate, and with the decrease in the death rate and an increase in life expectancy, China's overall natural population growth rate went down. But this story has a very dark side that almost cost China its future. The one-child policy was both fruitful and consequential, producing outcomes beyond the aim of reducing population growth. Most notably, the nation saw an imbalance in the overall sex ratio, with males between 3 to 4% more than females. This is because, in China, male children were preferred traditionally, as the male child inherits the family name and property, and is responsible for taking care of their parents upon getting older. With the one-child policy in effect, people stopped having female children, leading to an exponential increase in the abortion rate nationwide, particularly in rural areas. This resulted in an extreme bias towards female children. Some of them were aborted, some were placed in orphanages, and some were even completely abandoned by their parents. Over time, the gap widened between the number of females and males, and when those children came of age, it led to a highly undesirable situation where there were fewer females available for marriage. The policy also resulted in a growing proportion of elderly people, rooted in the massive drop in childbirth and the rise in longevity since 1980. This consequence led to a huge crisis for senior citizens, as the majority of them relied on their children to support them after their retirement. But there were fewer children to support them. A third consequence emerged, with the births of second children going unreported or kept hidden from the government. Those undocumented children faced many challenges and hardships in getting education and employment. One of the major consequences of the one-child policy that China had to face was the violation of human rights. The policy was enforced nationwide, leading to cases where women who wanted to keep their children were subjected to forced abortions and sterilization. This also resulted in a lack of reproductive freedom. Couples were not allowed to decide freely whether they wanted to keep the baby, which is a fundamental aspect of human reproductive rights. Not only that, but those couples who wouldn't comply with the policy were subjected to penalties ranging from fines to other punitive measures. However, the policy began to lose its effects in the 21st century when the birth rate started declining, and in 2015, the government announced terminating the program. In 2016, people were allowed to have more than one child, but that change in plan did not lead to an increase in the birth rate that had been declining for over 35 years. The policy that continued for a very long time affected people's lives and perceptions in many ways. Now, when the authorities allowed couples to have more than one child, they hesitated, and for a variety of reasons. One such reason was their concerns about not being able to afford a second child, as there was a lack of childcare and concerns about losing their jobs, affecting them professionally, particularly for mothers. In addition, decades of social change have changed their perception of life. Now, they think that having one child is preferable. One piece of data from the 2020 census highlighted a massive demographic and economic crisis in China, driven by low birth rates, an increase in the elderly population, and a shrinking workforce. In 2021, China even allowed families to have as many as 3 children, with a promise of promoting supportive policies and changes in employment, finances, childcare, and education. It's fair to say that the Chinese government has tried to change the order of nature, which has cost them dearly. For 35 years, they subjected millions of women to forced sterilization, contraception, and forced abortion, and they desperately want to change that by expecting people to comply again. How is this even fair? The worst part is no matter how hard they are trying to change their desperate situation by cutting taxes, subsidies, cash rewards, and even other incentives, nothing seems to work so far. Additionally, people are also criticizing their newly implemented policy. Some are saying that with housing and other aspects of life being so expensive, they can't afford to provide them for their second or third child, while others are showing concerns that having more than one child would badly impact their personal and professional lives. Despite the government's efforts, the birth rate is still far from recovering, and the population of China is declining day by day. What do you think will be China's demographic and economic trajectory in the near future? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Also, like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you want to watch more insightful videos in the future. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.